Tuesday, 2:14 a.m. The soldering iron tip glows a faint, angry orange against the scarred surface of the kitchen table. Arthur Jenkins holds the fine-gauge copper wire steady, his calloused thumb pinning the green circuit board down while a ribbon of toxic-smelling rosin smoke curls toward the ceiling. The radiator in the corner hisses, a rhythmic metallic stutter fighting the bitter Chicago winter pressing against the frosted window panes. In the next room, the pediatric heart monitor chirps, a synthetic, hollow beep that measures the exact distance between his 7-year-old daughter's life and the edge of a cliff. He leans closer to the magnifying glass clamped to the desk, sweat pooling in the deep lines framing his dark eyes. Another completed motherboard salvage means another $70 from the neighborhood electronic exchange. $70 covers exactly 2.5 days of Ruby's antiarrhythmic medication. The phone screen lights up on the linoleum counter, vibrating with violent urgency, scattering a handful of tiny silver screws across the floor. The screen flashes an unknown number. He swipes the green icon, bringing the cold glass to his ear, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Jenkins." A ragged inhalation shatters the line's static. "Mitchell, please, I'm bleeding. I can't get the door open." The voice is female, aristocratic even through the panic, fracturing into sharp shards of terror. Arthur's spine locks, his grip tightening on the plastic casing of the phone. "I am not Mitchell. You have the wrong number. Call 911. A choked sob echoes, the unmistakable sound of wet fabric sliding against tile. "He won't come. I know he won't come. They're going to take it all, Mitchell. Please, I don't want to die on this floor." The silence that follows stretches into a dark, terrible void, broken only by shallow, irregular gasps. Arthur stares through the darkened kitchen archway toward the hallway where Clara collapsed 3 years ago. The phantom echo of his late wife's final, desperate breath superimposes itself over the stranger's voice on the line. He closes his eyes, crushing the memory down into the locked vault behind his ribs. He cannot save Clara, but he cannot listen to a woman die in the dark. His massive hand grabs the rusted keys off the hook. "Where are you?" A faint, trembling whisper bleeds through the speaker. "Memorial. VIP wing. Room 4. The line clicks dead. Arthur moves with terrifying efficiency. He crosses the hallway in 2 strides, pausing at the threshold of Ruby's bedroom. The glow-in-the-dark stars on her ceiling cast a pale green luminescence over her small, fragile chest, rising and falling beneath the purple quilt. The monitor's graph peaks and dips, a visual representation of a mitral valve that is slowly, inevitably giving out. He checks the locked window, adjusts the thermostat, and dials his neighbor, Mrs. Gable, who lives across the hall. The elderly woman answers on the first ring, a testament to the hyper-vigilance of their tight-knit working-class building. Mrs. Gable's voice is sharp with instant clarity. "I'm putting my slippers on, Arthur. Go!" Memorial Hospital is a concrete monolith bathed in sickly sodium vapor light. Arthur parks his bruised 2008 Ford F250 between a pristine Mercedes and an empty ambulance bay. His steel-toed boots crack the frozen puddles on the asphalt. He wears his heavy canvas work jacket, the breast pocket permanently stained with diesel grease and oxidized iron. Inside, the emergency room smells of industrial bleach, stale coffee, and collective human desperation. The triage desk is fortified behind bulletproof plexiglass. An exhausted triage nurse taps away at a keyboard, actively ignoring the chaos blooming in the crowded waiting area. Arthur approaches, his broad 6'3" frame eclipsing the overhead fluorescent light. "A woman called my phone 12 minutes ago from the VIP wing, room 4. She is hemorrhaging." The nurse doesn't look up from her glowing monitor. "The VIP wing is closed to unauthorized visitors, sir. Take a number and have a seat. We're at capacity." His large, scarred hand flattens over her keyboard, halting her typing instantly. The absolute stillness in his posture radiates a gravitational weight, a quiet, terrifying competence. A woman is bleeding out on your property. You will unlock those double doors or I will take them off their hinges. I have dignity, I deserve respect, and right now, you are going to respect the fact that someone is dying on your watch. The nurse's head snaps up, meeting his unwavering obsidian gaze. The air pressure in the room seems to shift. She reaches under the desk, her finger trembling against the security buzzer. The heavy magnetic locks on the double doors disengage with a loud clack. Arthur strides down the pristine, aggressively sterile corridor of the private wing. The lighting here is softer, the floors polished marble instead of scuffed linoleum. Room 4's door is slightly ajar. He pushes it open, the heavy wood gliding silently on well-oiled hinges. The woman is curled on the floor beside the luxurious hospital bed, clutching a blood-soaked silk blouse against her abdomen. Her skin is the color of crushed chalk, her dark hair plastered to her forehead with cold sweat. A standalone oxygen concentrator sits nearby, its primary valve hissing, leaking precious air into the empty room instead of feeding the nasal cannula tangled around her wrists. Arthur drops to his knees. He doesn't panic. He is a master mechanic, a man whose entire life is built on diagnosing catastrophic system failures and forcing them back into alignment. He strips off his heavy canvas jacket, rolling it into a tight cylinder, and slides it under her head. Her eyelids flutter, revealing striking glass-green eyes clouded with delirium. "Mitchell, you came." His thick fingers find the pulse point at her throat, rapid, thready. "I am not Mitchell. Do not try to speak." He turns his attention to the hissing oxygen concentrator, a stripped cross-thread on the regulator valve. Amateurs. He grips the brass fitting, his calluses digging into the metal, and twists with a sharp, calculated torque. The hissing stops instantly. The flow meter stabilizes. He untangles the plastic tubing and gently secures the prongs beneath her nose. The door bursts open. A team of night shift doctors and nurses flood the room, alerted by the sudden spike in her telemetry now that the sensor pads are reattached to the monitors. A young resident grabs Arthur's shoulder to pull him away. Arthur doesn't budge. He stands slowly, towering over the medical staff, his voice a low, commanding baritone that demands order in the chaos. "She has localized hemorrhaging in the lower right quadrant. Heart rate is 140. I stabilized her oxygen flow. The regulator was stripped. Get her on the bed. Watch the IV line on her left arm. It's kinked at the elbow." The attending physician blinks, momentarily stunned by the precise clinical breakdown coming from a man covered in diesel grease. They lift her onto the mattress. The bloody silk blouse is cut away. Arthur steps back into the shadows near the window, blending into the dark mahogany paneling of the VIP suite. He should leave. His job is done. But the sheer, profound isolation in the woman's glass-green eyes as the doctors swarm over her pins his boots to the floor. Clara died surrounded by family. This woman, whoever she is, has a phone full of contacts and not a single person who answered the call. He stays. He sits in the rigid leather armchair in the corner while the medical team stems the bleeding caused by a ruptured biopsy site. He watches the toxic drip of a specialized chemotherapy drug hang from the IV pole. Leukemia. The chart on the digital display reads, Victoria Caldwell, age 40, Caldwell Logistics, the empire that owns half the freight lines operating out of the Midwest. The woman bleeding on the sheets controls a multi-billion-dollar supply chain. For the next 4 hours, Arthur does not sleep. He watches the steady rise and fall of her chest, ensuring the rhythm doesn't falter. He watches the dawn break over the Chicago skyline, bleeding pale purple light through the blinds. At 6 a.m., before she wakes, he stands up. He doesn't leave a note. He doesn't ask for a reward. He zips up his stained jacket and walks out of the marble corridor, trading the sterile wealth of the hospital for the freezing wind of the city streets. By 7:30, Arthur is back in his cramped two-bedroom apartment. The smell of frying eggs and burnt toast fills the small kitchen. Ruby sits at the Formica table, her thin legs swinging above the worn linoleum. She is drawing on the back of a past-due electric bill with a blue crayon. Her gap-toothed smile brightens the entire room as Arthur sets a plate in front of her. Her large, incredibly perceptive brown eyes lock onto his face. "You smell like the hospital, Daddy. Did you go see Mama's angel?" Arthur's chest tightens. He pours a glass of orange juice, carefully measuring out her morning pills. "Something like that, little bird. Eat your eggs. We have to see Dr. Eris today." Ruby's smile fades slightly, but she nods, dutifully swallowing the bitter pills. She is too wise for a 7-year-old, a child forged in waiting rooms and diagnostic labs. She slides the electric bill across the table. It is a drawing of a man with massive shoulders standing in front of a dark, scary-looking box. "Are you fighting bad guys, Daddy?" He traces the blue crayon lines with a grease-stained thumb. "Just the ones I can see, Ruby. Get your coat." The cardiology wing of the pediatric center is painted in aggressively cheerful primary colors that only make the sterile environment feel more oppressive. Arthur sits on the edge of the examining table, holding Ruby's small hand, while Dr. Eris stares at the echocardiogram monitor. The grayscale image of Ruby's heart beats rhythmically on the screen, a mesmerizing, terrifying dance of muscle and fluid. Dr. Eris turns off the machine, the silence in the room suddenly deafening. He takes off his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "The mitral valve is degrading faster than our initial projections, Arthur. The regurgitation is severe. We can't wait another year. We can't even wait 6 months." The air leaves Arthur's lungs. The clinical walls seem to close in. "How long?" Dr. Eris looks him dead in the eye. 8 weeks, 10 at the absolute maximum. She needs the mechanical valve replacement now. Arthur's jaw clenches. "We submitted the pre-approval to insurance 3 weeks ago." The doctor sighs, pulling a thick manila folder from his desk. "They denied the specialized pediatric hardware. They claim it's experimental and out of network. They'll cover the baseline procedure, but the hardware and the specialized surgical team. Arthur, it's going to be $240,000 out of pocket before they will schedule the OR. $240,000. It might as well be 200 million. Arthur stares at the linoleum floor. He works 60 hours a week managing the maintenance yard for a logistics subcontractor. He repairs circuit boards at night. He skips meals. He owns nothing of value. The math is a brick wall rushing toward him at 100 miles an hour. He stands up, lifting Ruby effortlessly off the table and settling her onto his hip. Her arms wrap around his thick neck. He looks at the doctor, his voice completely level, betraying none of the absolute terror threatening to tear his mind apart. "I will get the money. Put her on the surgical schedule." By midday, the roar of the heavy machinery yard is a welcome assault on his senses. The Caldwell Logistics Regional Maintenance Hub is a sprawling acreage of mud, diesel fumes, and grinding metal. Arthur is beneath the belly of a massive 18-wheeler, a heavy pneumatic wrench in his hand, wrestling with a shattered transmission housing. The physical exertion is the only thing keeping the panic at bay. The grease coating his hands is familiar, a tangible problem he knows how to solve. A sudden, unnatural silence falls over the bustling yard. The deafening chatter of impact drivers and the shouting of the mechanics abruptly cease. Arthur slides out from under the rig on his plastic creeper. A sleek midnight black town car is parked directly in the center of the muddy lot, completely blocking the main service bay. The driver, wearing a pristine dark suit, steps out and opens the rear door. A pair of sharp black stilettos steps into the oily mud without hesitation. Victoria Caldwell emerges. She looks nothing like the fragile, bleeding woman on the hospital floor. She is armored in a tailored charcoal suit that screams bespoke wealth. Her dark hair is pulled back into a severe, perfect chignon. Her pale skin is covered with flawless makeup, hiding the bruising and the exhaustion. But her glass-green eyes, sharp and calculating, lock onto Arthur instantly across the yard. The Ice Queen has returned to her throne. She walks toward him, ignoring the stares of 30 filthy mechanics. She stops at the edge of his service bay, looking down at his oil-soaked coveralls. Her voice is crisp, carrying the undeniable authority of a woman used to owning the ground she stands on. "Mr. Jenkins, you are a difficult man to track down. The hospital registry only had your phone number. It took my security team 6 hours to cross-reference it to a subcontractor payroll." Arthur stands up slowly, wiping his hands on a red shop rag. He towers over her, unaffected by her wealth or her aura of command. "I didn't leave a name because I didn't want to be found, Ms. Caldwell. Your transmission is leaking. If you aren't here for a service ticket, you are in my way." A flicker of surprise breaks her pristine facade. Men do not speak to her this way, ever. She recovers instantly, her chin tilting up. "I need 10 minutes of your time. In private." He tosses the dirty rag onto a workbench. "I'm on the clock. You have 3 minutes, right here." Victoria glances at the grease-stained mechanics openly eavesdropping nearby. She steps closer, invading his personal space, bringing with her the scent of expensive sandalwood and the faint chemical undertone of hospital antiseptic. "Last night you saved my life. You also saw my medical chart. You know about the leukemia." Arthur's face remains a mask of carved mahogany. "I saw a woman bleeding. I stopped the bleeding. What is on your chart is none of my business." "It is the business of my board of directors," she counters, her voice dropping to a harsh, urgent whisper. "Mitchell Davis, my vice president and my former partner, is attempting a hostile takeover. He is building a case to trigger a medical incapacity clause in the corporate charter. He wants to prove that I am mentally unstable, physically failing, and entirely isolated. If the board votes him in, he will dismantle the company my grandfather built and sell it for parts." Arthur picks up a heavy wrench, testing its weight. "Corporate politics, not my circus." Victoria pulls a thick, embossed envelope from her designer bag and holds it out. "I need a shield, Mr. Jenkins. I need a presence. Someone who is completely outside the corporate sphere, someone Mitchell cannot buy or intimidate. I need to present a narrative of stability, a partner, a relationship that proves I am not a dying, isolated spinster losing her grip on reality." He stops moving. He stares at the envelope, then slowly meets her eyes. "You want to hire me to be your fake boyfriend?" She doesn't flinch. "I want to retain your services as a companion for public and corporate events over the next 6 months. The compensation is $1.5 million, half deposited into an escrow account today, the remainder upon completion." The number echoes in the cavernous steel bay. 1.5 million. The exact weight of a new mechanical heart valve, a specialized surgical team, and a future for his daughter. The universe is playing a cruel, high-stakes game. Arthur's jaw tightens, the muscles ticking under his dark skin. The anger flares first, hot and righteous. He knows exactly what this is. She looks at his worn boots, his grease-stained jacket, his calloused hands, and sees a commodity. A desperate, working-class man she can purchase to play a role. He slaps the heavy wrench down onto the metal workbench with a loud, ringing crack. Victoria jumps, startled by the sudden violence. He leans down, his face inches from hers. The quiet intensity in his voice is far more terrifying than a shout. "You think poverty makes a man pliable. You think desperation is a price tag you can just scan. Keep your money, Ms. Caldwell. I have dignity. I deserve respect. I am not a prop you can rent to scare away your ex-boyfriend." He turns his back on her, grabbing his impact driver, the universal signal of dismissal. Victoria stands frozen in the mud. For a terrifying second, the Ice Queen armor shatters completely. The boardroom predator vanishes, leaving only the terrified, bleeding woman from the hospital floor. Her hands tremble, her pristine nails digging into the leather of her purse. "He locked the door, Arthur." The words slip out of her, raw and completely unscripted. Arthur stops. The impact driver hums idly in his hand. Victoria swallows hard, fighting a losing battle against the moisture pooling in her green eyes. "When the biopsy ruptured, I called him. Mitchell was in the house. He heard me fall. He walked to the master suite and he locked the door from the outside. He left me to bleed out so he wouldn't have to face a board vote. The silence between them stretches thick and suffocating, drowning out the ambient noise of the heavy machinery yard. Arthur turns his head. He looks at her face, truly looks at it. Beneath the flawless foundation, the dark circles of exhaustion and cellular decay are profound. She is fighting a war on two fronts, her own traitorous bone marrow and the man who is supposed to have her back. He thinks of the surgical schedule. He thinks of the terrified chirp of Ruby's heart monitor. He thinks of Clara slipping away because they didn't have the money for the experimental trial. He shuts off the impact driver. He turns fully around, walking back to where she stands, shivering in the cold wind. He looks down at the embossed envelope still clutched in her trembling hand. "If we do this," Arthur's voice is low, stripping away the corporate transactional nature of the moment entirely. "It happens on my terms. I am not a puppet. I will not stand quietly in a corner while your board disrespects you. And I will not let you treat me like an employee in public." Victoria nods slowly, her breath catching in her throat. "More importantly," Arthur continues, his dark eyes locking onto hers with absolute unyielding moral clarity, "I have a daughter. Her name is Ruby. She is 7 years old, and she is the only thing in this world that matters. You will not lie to her. You do not treat my home like a stage set. When you step through my front door, the CEO stays outside, understood?" Victoria stares at the massive, grease-stained man. He is a force of nature, an immovable object of integrity in a world built on quicksand. She extends her hand, not holding the envelope, but offering an actual handshake. "Understood, Mr. Jenkins." He looks at her pale, perfectly manicured hand. He reaches out, his massive, calloused fingers enveloping hers. The grease transfers to her pristine skin, a permanent stain on the arrangement. The contract is sealed. The collision of their two completely alien worlds is set into motion. As the black town car reverses out of the muddy yard, Arthur returns to the belly of the broken Peterbilt engine. The timeline is ticking. 8 weeks for a heart, 6 months for a corporate empire. He tightens his grip on the wrench. He will rebuild this shattered woman's defenses, secure his daughter's life, and hold the line against anyone who tries to break them. The evening wind howls off Lake Michigan, rattling the thin glass of Arthur's apartment windows. He scrubs his hands with pumice soap at the kitchen sink, watching the dark, gritty foam swirl down the drain. The heavy scent of orange degreaser masks the lingering hospital smell. He dries his hands on a rough towel and walks into the living room. Ruby is sitting cross-legged on the worn rug, carefully assembling a complex puzzle of the solar system. The TV hums quietly in the background, casting a flickering blue light across the small room. Arthur sinks onto the battered sofa, feeling the deep ache in his lumbar spine. He watches his daughter, the delicate curve of her neck, the slight blue tinge to her lips that tells him her oxygen saturation is dipping again. The escrow notification had pinged his phone an hour ago, $750,000. The weight of it feels entirely different from the $70 he earned soldering the circuit board. It feels dangerous. Ruby presses the piece of Jupiter into place and looks up. Her large, observant eyes study his face. She misses nothing. "Did you finish the scary box, Daddy?" "I finished it, little bird," he replies gently. She crawls over to the sofa and climbs into his lap, pressing her ear against his massive chest. She always listens to his heart, as if reassuring herself that at least one heart in the house is strong enough to keep beating forever. "Are you sad?" Arthur wraps his thick arms around her fragile frame. "No, baby. I'm just preparing for a new job. It's going to be a little different." Ruby tilts her head. "Different how?" "I have to help a lady," he says, measuring his words carefully. He refuses to lie to her. She's fighting her own bad guys, and she needs someone to stand next to her so they know she's not alone. Ruby considers this, her small brow furrowing in deep thought. She reaches into the pocket of her overalls and pulls out the folded electric bill. She smooths out the drawing of the massive man in the dark box. In the corner, she has added a new figure, a tall, stick-figure woman in a sharp suit. "Is it the lady with no smile?" Ruby asks, pointing a small finger at her masterpiece. Arthur stares at the drawing, a cold shiver trailing down his spine at his daughter's uncanny perception. He pulls her closer, burying his face in her soft hair. "Yeah, Ruby, it's the lady with no smile, but we're going to help her find it." The first official test of the arrangement arrives 3 days later. Thursday evening, the Caldwell Logistics Annual Executive Gala. It is a mandatory appearance, a high society battlefield designed to gauge the health and stability of the corporate leadership. Victoria had sent a bespoke suit to his apartment earlier that afternoon. Midnight blue wool, perfectly tailored with a crisp white shirt and a silk tie. Arthur stands in front of the cracked mirror in his bedroom. He doesn't recognize the man staring back. The grease is scrubbed from his fingernails, his short hair is sharply faded, and the expensive fabric drapes over his muscular frame with dangerous elegance. He adjusts the cuffs, feeling like an imposter wearing stolen armor. Clara had loved him in a suit. The thought sends a sharp, familiar spike of grief through his chest. A sharp knock at the front door pulls him from the memory. Mrs. Gable is already in the living room setting up a board game with Ruby. Arthur opens the door. Victoria stands in the dimly lit hallway of the working-class apartment complex. She wears an emerald green evening gown that perfectly matches her eyes. The silk fabric clings to her gaunt frame, highlighting the weight she has lost to the chemotherapy. Her makeup is flawless, a defensive mask of untouchable glamour. But as her eyes sweep over Arthur, the mask slips slightly. She takes a small breath, visibly adjusting her posture. "The tailor did exceptional work, Arthur." He steps out into the hallway, pulling the door shut behind him. He does not offer a compliment in return. He is not here to flirt. He is here to do a job. "What are the parameters for tonight?" Victoria begins walking down the hallway toward the waiting elevator. Her stilettos click sharply against the cracked tile. "We arrive together. We circulate the room. You stay close. Mitchell will be there. He has been telling the board that I am confined to a wheelchair at home, suffering from chemo-induced dementia. Our goal tonight is simply to exist in the same space, looking unified and strong. If anyone asks about your background, you manage fleet logistics. It is the truth, just appropriately vague." Arthur presses the elevator button. The doors rattle open. And when Mitchell tries to push, Victoria steps into the metal box, her jaw tightening. "You let me handle Mitchell. He thrives on provocation. If you react, you give him exactly what he wants. A narrative that I am associating with volatile, aggressive men because my judgment is impaired." The elevator begins its slow descent. Arthur stares at the digital floor counter. "Intent doesn't erase impact, Victoria. If he disrespects you in front of me, I will not stand there like a rented mannequin." She turns to face him, her green eyes flashing with sudden, sharp authority. "You agreed to my terms. I am the CEO. I manage the board." "I agreed to stand beside you," Arthur corrects, his deep voice filling the small, enclosed space. "Not behind you. There is a difference. If you want a bodyguard, hire security. If you want a partner, you let me handle the men who think they can step over you." The doors slide open to the lobby. Victoria stares at him for a long, calculating moment. She is used to men who either defer to her wealth or try to dominate her power. Arthur is doing neither. He is claiming his own space entirely. She offers her arm. "Shall we, Mr. Jenkins?" He loops her arm through his. "Lead the way, Miss Caldwell." The ballroom of the Drake Hotel is a cavernous expanse of crystal chandeliers, gold leaf molding, and the suffocating pressure of hundreds of calculating eyes. The moment Victoria and Arthur step through the double mahogany doors, the ambient noise in the room drops noticeably. Heads turn, whispers ripple through the crowd like wind over dry grass. Arthur keeps his posture perfectly rigid. He walks with the slow, deliberate gait of a predator comfortable in its own territory. He feels the slight tremor in Victoria's hand where it rests on his forearm. She is smiling, projecting absolute radiance, but he can feel the erratic flutter of her pulse against his sleeve. The armor is heavy tonight. They navigate the room, stopping to exchange pleasantries with hedge fund managers, logistics vice presidents, and corporate lawyers. Victoria is masterful. She deflects questions about her health with sharp wit and seamlessly introduces Arthur. He plays his part perfectly. He speaks little, his deep, resonant voice carrying just enough authority to command respect without revealing the grease-stained reality of his daily life. An hour into the gala, the crowd parts near the champagne fountain. Mitchell Davis approaches. He has everything Arthur despises: silver hair swept back with expensive product, a custom Italian suit, and the arrogant, relaxed smile of a man who has never had to suffer a consequence in his life. He holds a crystal flute of champagne, flanked by two older board members who look like nervous remoras trailing a shark. Mitchell stops directly in front of Victoria, completely ignoring Arthur's massive presence. "Victoria, darling," Mitchell purrs, his voice dripping with condescension. "I am shocked to see you out of bed. The board was just discussing your leave of absence. We were deeply concerned about the latest medical reports. You look so frail." Victoria's grip on Arthur's arm tightens like a vice. Her smile remains frozen in place. "My medical reports are confidential, Mitchell. And as you can see, I am perfectly capable of attending my own gala. There will be no leave of absence." Mitchell chuckles, a dry, dismissive sound. He finally turns his gaze toward Arthur, his eyes raking up and down the midnight blue suit with obvious disdain. "And who is this? I wasn't aware the hospital was dispatching orderlies to chaperone our events." The two board members snicker quietly. The disrespect is blatant, designed to humiliate Victoria by diminishing the man she brought. Victoria opens her mouth to deliver a cutting corporate retort, but Arthur steps forward. He moves smoothly, sliding slightly in front of Victoria, placing his large body between her and Mitchell. The physical barrier is undeniable. Arthur looks down at Mitchell. The height difference is only 3 inches, but Arthur's sheer density makes it feel like 3 feet. He does not raise his voice. He does not clench his fists. He simply lets the absolute terrifying stillness of his working-class survival instinct bleed into the opulent ballroom. "My name is Arthur Jenkins," he says, his baritone vibrating in the crystal glasses on the nearby table. "I manage fleet logistics. I keep the engines running that pay for your Italian suit, Mitchell. And while you were busy reading stolen medical charts, I was busy making sure Victoria doesn't have to tolerate the presence of cowards." The silence that crashes over their small circle is absolute. The two board members pale, taking a collective step backward. Mitchell's arrogant smile vanishes, his face flushing dark red. "Excuse me?" Mitchell sneers, trying to reclaim the dominance he just lost. "Do you have any idea who you are talking to?" "I know exactly who you are," Arthur replies, his dark eyes boring into Mitchell's soul, stripping away the wealth and the title, seeing only the weak, locked-door coward underneath. "You are the man standing in our way. Move." It is a command, not a request. The sheer physical reality of Arthur's presence is overwhelming. Mitchell looks at Arthur's eyes, searching for a bluff, and finds only a vast, dark ocean of consequence. Mitchell's jaw works silently. He takes a step to the side. Arthur doesn't look back. He places his hand on the small of Victoria's back, guiding her past Mitchell and the stunned board members. Cutting a path straight through the crowd, they walk out onto the sprawling outdoor terrace. The freezing Chicago wind hits them instantly, a sharp contrast to the stifling heat of the ballroom. Victoria walks to the stone balustrade, gripping the cold marble. She is shaking, not from the cold, but from the massive adrenaline dump of the confrontation. Arthur stands a few feet away, giving her space. He pulls off his suit jacket and drapes it over her bare shoulders. The warmth of his body heat transfers to the heavy wool. Victoria looks down at the city lights reflecting on the dark water of the lake. She takes a deep, shuddering breath. You shouldn't have done that. He will dig into your background now. He will look for every flaw, every unpaid bill, every weakness you have. Let him look, Arthur says quietly, stepping up to the balustrade beside her. I don't have anything to hide. My life is grease and medical bills. He can't threaten me with ruin because I already live there. She turns to face him, pulling the jacket tighter around her thin shoulders. The Ice Queen armor is completely gone, leaving only the woman from the hospital floor staring at him with a mixture of awe and profound confusion. Why aren't you afraid of him? Men like Mitchell destroy people like you for sport. Arthur looks out at the dark horizon. He thinks of the pediatric monitor. He thinks of the $70 for the circuit board. He thinks of Clara. Because Mitchell thinks power is money, Arthur answers, his voice a low, steady rumble against the wind. He thinks power is locking a door and walking away, but that's just cruelty. Caring looks different from controlling, Victoria. Power is holding a dying child's hand and still finding the strength to go to work the next day. Mitchell has never fought a war he couldn't buy his way out of. I fight one every single morning. Victoria stares at his strong, scarred profile. The wind whips a stray strand of dark hair across her cheek. For the first time in years, the crushing, suffocating loneliness inside her chest eases. Just a fraction. She is looking at a man who cannot be bought, cannot be bullied, and cannot be broken by the shallow games of her world. She reaches out her pale, trembling hand, gently touching his forearm. It is a genuine gesture of connection, stripping away the transactional nature of the contract entirely. Thank you, Arthur. He looks down at her hand, then meets her green eyes. He doesn't smile, but the hard lines around his mouth soften. We have a long way to go, Ms. Caldwell. Better button up the coat. The drive back to Arthur's apartment is silent, but the heavy, oppressive tension from earlier in the evening has evaporated. Victoria sits in the passenger seat of her town car, wrapped in Arthur's jacket, watching the city blur past the tinted windows. Arthur sits beside her, staring straight ahead. The car pulls up to the cracked curb of his apartment building. It is nearly midnight. Victoria turns to him as he opens the door to step out. The board meeting is next Tuesday. They will call a vote on the incapacity clause. I will need you there. Arthur nods slowly. I'll be there. He steps out into the freezing night, shutting the heavy door. He walks up the cracked concrete steps to his building, the midnight blue suit looking entirely out of place under the flickering yellow porch light. Victoria watches him until he disappears inside. She pulls the heavy wool jacket tighter around her chest, inhaling the faint scent of orange degreaser and clean soap. The cold, impenetrable fortress of her life has a massive, undeniable breach in its walls. Arthur unlocks the deadbolt to his apartment. The quiet hum of the refrigerator greets him. He shrugs off the suit tie, unbuttoning the crisp white shirt. He walks into Ruby's bedroom. Mrs. Gable is asleep in the rocking chair in the corner. Arthur gently places a blanket over the older woman's shoulders before walking to his daughter's bed. Ruby is sound asleep, her small chest rising and falling to the synthetic chirp of the monitor. Her blue crayon drawing is resting on the nightstand. Arthur sits on the edge of the mattress, resting his large, calloused hand gently over her heart. He can feel the erratic flutter beneath her ribs. The timeline is ticking down. 7 weeks left. But the money is in the escrow account. The surgical team is booked. He has secured her survival. He looks at the drawing on the nightstand. The tall, massive man standing next to the stick figure woman in the sharp suit. Arthur leans down, kissing Ruby's warm forehead. The battle lines have been drawn. Mitchell Davis thinks he is fighting a corporate skirmish against a dying woman. He doesn't realize he has just declared war on a father who has absolutely nothing left to lose. Arthur closes his eyes, letting the darkness of the room wash over him, preparing for the violent collision of worlds that is inevitably coming. Sunday morning sunlight pierced the gaps in the warped plastic blinds, casting pale, parallel stripes across the worn linoleum of the small kitchen. Arthur stood at the counter, a battered cast-iron skillet in his hand. The rich, heavy scent of sizzling butter and vanilla extract filled the cramped space, briefly overpowering the ever-present faint, sterile smell of the medical equipment in the next room. He flipped a golden pancake with the practiced precision of a man who measured his life in repetitive, necessary actions. His thick shoulders relaxed marginally under a faded gray sweatshirt. Sundays were a sanctuary. For a few brief hours, the crushing weight of the logistics yard and the looming medical deadlines receded behind the locked deadbolt of his front door. Ruby sat at the wobbly Formica table, her small fingers meticulously arranging a set of colorful plastic blocks into a towering, structurally unsound fortress. The pediatric heart monitor clipped to her waistband emitted its steady, synthetic chirp. The rhythm was faster than a healthy child's, a constant digital reminder of the failing mitral valve struggling within her chest. She wore a bright yellow sweater that swallowed her fragile frame, her dark curls pulled back into two neat braids Arthur had tied himself. A sharp, hesitant knock broke the domestic quiet. Arthur slid the skillet off the burner. He wiped his hands on a dish towel, his expression hardening as he moved toward the front door. The neighborhood was tight-knit. Neighbors didn't knock like that. They yelled through the thin walls or tapped a familiar rhythm. This knock was deliberate, formal, and entirely out of place in a building where the intercom system had been broken since the previous decade. He unfastened the chain lock and pulled the heavy door open. Victoria Caldwell stood in the dimly lit hallway. The transition from the opulent corporate gala to the peeling paint of the third-floor landing was jarring. She wore a tailored beige cashmere sweater and dark slacks, an outfit clearly intended to be casual but screaming of a price tag that could cover a month's rent for the entire floor. Her dark hair was loose, falling in soft waves around her shoulders, framing a face that looked paler than usual under the flickering fluorescent bulb of the corridor. She held a sleek, insulated bakery box in one hand, her knuckles white from the tight grip. Her green eyes flicked past Arthur, taking in the cramped dimensions of the living room, the frayed edges of the sofa, the stack of medical billing envelopes resting on the coffee table. She seemed to shrink slightly, the dominating corporate presence evaporating in the face of raw, working-class reality. "I apologize for the intrusion." Her voice was tight, carefully modulated to hide a deep, underlying uncertainty. "The contract stipulates a unified public front. My public relations team indicated that a Sunday morning brunch appearance at a local establishment would solidify the narrative before the board meeting. I brought pastries from a patisserie downtown." Arthur did not move from the threshold. He looked at the bakery box, then up at her face. The dark circles beneath her eyes were poorly concealed by expensive foundation. She looked exhausted, brittle, a woman operating entirely on the adrenaline of survival. The corporate excuse was a thin veil. She was seeking refuge from the echoing emptiness of her own massive estate. "The paparazzi don't come to this neighborhood, Victoria." His baritone was low, devoid of malice but firm in its boundary. "And Ruby doesn't eat processed sugar from downtown patisseries. Her sodium and glucose intake is strictly monitored." Victoria recoiled slightly, her gaze dropping to the floor. The rejection stung, a sharp reminder that her wealth held no currency here. "I didn't think. I'm sorry. I will inform the team to cancel the outing." She turned to leave, the expensive leather of her shoes pivoting on the scuffed hallway tile. "Victoria." She stopped, looking back over her shoulder. Arthur stepped aside, opening the door wider. "The pancakes are buttermilk. The syrup is sugar-free. We have a spare chair. Leave the box on the radiator." A microscopic fraction of the tension drained from her rigid spine. She stepped over the threshold, entering a world fundamentally alien to her own. The apartment was small, the furniture mismatched and worn, but the space was impeccably clean. A bookshelf in the corner held a mix of advanced mechanical engineering manuals and brightly illustrated children's books. A framed photograph rested on the highest shelf. A beautiful, dark-skinned woman with a radiant smile holding a newborn baby, Clara. Victoria looked away quickly, feeling a sudden, intense wave of intrusion. Arthur pulled out a vinyl-covered chair at the kitchen table. "Sit. Coffee is in the pot." Victoria lowered herself into the chair, her cashmere sweater brushing against the sticky residue of a spilled juice box from the day before. She folded her hands in her lap, utterly unsure of how to navigate a room where she possessed no authority. Ruby stopped building her plastic fortress. She rested her chin on her small hands, her large, intensely perceptive brown eyes locking onto the stranger in her kitchen. She didn't offer a greeting. She simply observed, processing the arrival with the profound, unsettling wisdom of a child who spent too much time in adult spaces. Arthur placed a steaming plate of pancakes in front of Victoria, followed by a chipped ceramic mug filled with black coffee. He sat down opposite her, handing Ruby a smaller plate. "Eat," Arthur commanded gently. The silence in the kitchen was thick, punctuated only by the scrape of forks against porcelain and the relentless chirp of the medical monitor. Victoria took a small bite. The food was warm, grounding. It tasted nothing like the sterile catered meals served in the executive dining rooms of Caldwell Logistics. She looked across the table at the massive man methodically cutting his daughter's food, his calloused hands moving with surprising tenderness. Ruby swallowed a bite of her pancake, her gaze never leaving Victoria's face. She tilted her head, the two neat braids shifting against her yellow sweater. "You are the lady with no smile." Ruby's voice was clear, ringing with innocent absolute certainty. Victoria froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. She looked at the little girl, entirely unprepared for the directness. "I smile, Ruby, sometimes." Ruby shook her head slowly. "No. You show your teeth, but you don't smile. You look like the people in the waiting room at the hospital." The child pointed a small, syrup-sticky finger toward Victoria's face. "You are the lady with no smile, but your eyes are crying." The room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The air vanished from Victoria's lungs. The child's words were a surgical blade, slicing cleanly through decades of emotional armor, through the board maneuvers, the hostile takeovers, the defensive walls built against a predatory ex-boyfriend. A 7-year-old girl with a failing heart had just articulated the profound, agonizing truth of Victoria's existence. She was drowning in isolation. Victoria stared at the plastic blocks on the table, her vision blurring as hot, sudden moisture pooled in her eyes. She swallowed hard, fighting the physical constriction in her throat. She had built a logistics empire spanning 3 continents, but sitting in this cramped kitchen, she realized she had absolutely nothing to come home to, no one to notice the crying behind the unsmiling eyes. Arthur reached across the table. His massive hand gently covered Ruby's small fingers, lowering them back to her plate. "Finish your breakfast, little bird. It's impolite to stare." He didn't apologize for his daughter's observation. He didn't offer Victoria a platitude. He simply stood up, grabbed the coffee pot, and refilled her chipped mug. The mundane anchoring action offered her a lifeline, a moment to reconstruct her shattered composure. "The board meeting is in 2 days." Victoria's voice was a fragile whisper, desperately clinging to the safety of business logistics. "Mitchell has filed a motion for an emergency medical review." Arthur set the pot down. "Then we give them a review. We walk into that room and we show them a woman who isn't going anywhere. Drink your coffee." The domestic intimacy of the morning slowly morphed into a quiet, shared endurance. Victoria stayed for 2 hours watching Arthur manage the relentless, terrifying routine of Ruby's medication schedule. She watched him measure liquid diuretics in a plastic syringe, his face a mask of total concentration, ensuring every drop was accounted for. She witnessed the brutal, unglamorous reality of a father keeping his child alive by sheer force of will. The transactional nature of their $1.5 million contract felt increasingly absurd, a shallow piece of paper floating on the surface of an ocean of real devastating stakes. Evening fell over the city, dragging a bitter, freezing rain against the apartment windows. The streetlights flickered to life, casting long, distorted shadows across the living room floor. Ruby was exhausted, the physical toll of a long day catching up with her compromised cardiovascular system. Arthur carried her into the small bedroom, the glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling providing the only light. Victoria stood awkwardly in the hallway, leaning against the doorframe, a silent observer to a sacred ritual. Arthur pulled the purple quilt up to Ruby's chin. He sat on the edge of the narrow mattress, his large frame dwarfing the child's bed. "Tell me the garden story, Daddy." Ruby's voice was drowsy, slurring slightly as sleep pulled at her. Arthur smoothed a dark curl away from her forehead. "Your mama always loved the dirt. She said the city was too gray, so she found that empty lot behind the old train station. It was full of rusted metal and broken glass. Most people looked at it and saw a graveyard for trash." Victoria held her breath in the hallway. The deep, resonant cadence of Arthur's voice was hypnotic, stripping away the harsh edges of the world. "But Clara didn't see trash," Arthur continued, his voice dropping to a low, rhythmic hum. "She saw what it could be. She spent 3 weeks digging out the concrete blocks. She blistered her hands pulling up the wire fencing. People told her she was crazy. They told her the soil was poisoned, that nothing would ever grow there." Ruby's eyes fluttered closed. "But she planted the seeds anyway." "She planted the seeds anyway," Arthur confirmed, "because she knew that if you clear out the poison and you tend to the ground every single day, the earth has no choice but to give you something beautiful back. She grew tomatoes the size of softballs. She grew sunflowers that reached over the brick wall. She took a broken piece of the world and she fixed it with patience." The monitor chirped its steady, fragile rhythm. Ruby was asleep. Arthur sat there for a long moment, staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars. He leaned down, pressing a long kiss to his daughter's cheek before quietly standing up and walking out of the room. He pulled the door nearly shut, leaving it cracked just enough to hear the monitor. He walked past Victoria without a word, heading into the kitchen. The relentless dripping of the kitchen faucet echoed in the quiet apartment. Plink, plink, plink. A deteriorated rubber gasket in the ancient plumbing. Victoria followed him, the soft cashmere of her sweater a stark contrast to the harsh fluorescent kitchen light he flicked on. Arthur knelt on the worn linoleum, opening the cabinet beneath the sink. He pulled out a heavy canvas tool bag, the metallic clatter of wrenches breaking the silence. He slid his broad shoulders beneath the basin, maneuvering a heavy pipe wrench around the corroded brass fitting. The physical exertion was immediate. The muscles in his forearms corded, his jaw clenched as he applied brutal, calculated torque to the rusted metal. Victoria pulled out the vinyl chair and sat down. The emotional weight of the bedtime story lingered in the air, pressing against her ribcage. She had spent her entire life surrounded by people who discarded broken things. Employees who missed targets were fired. Divisions that lost profit margins were liquidated. Partners who proved inconvenient were locked out of hospital rooms. Mitchell was the chief operations officer when my father died. The words spilled out of her, unprompted, bypassing her usual corporate filters. She stared at the scratched surface of the Formica table. I was 28, terrified. The board smelled blood in the water. Mitchell stepped in. He shielded me. He mentored me. We built the Eastern Logistics Hub together. I thought we were forging an empire. Arthur grunted from beneath the sink. The wrench slipped, metal grinding against metal. He adjusted his grip, his knuckles whitening. When the diagnosis came back, Victoria continued, her voice trembling, stripping away the Ice Queen completely. I told him first, before the doctors even drafted the treatment plan. I thought he would hold the line. Instead, he started auditing my signature authorizations the very next morning. He began having private lunches with the board members who hated my father. He didn't just abandon me, Arthur. He actively began digging my grave. A sharp, metallic squeal echoed from the plumbing. Arthur hauled his upper body out from under the sink. He wiped a streak of grease from his cheek with the back of his hand. He sat back on his heels, holding the heavy wrench, looking up at the woman who controlled billions of dollars but could not control the terror in her own heart. "You gave him the keys to the engine." Arthur's voice was a low, steady rumble. He set the wrench down on the linoleum, and when it started sputtering, he stripped it for parts instead of fixing the block. Victoria closed her eyes, a single tear escaping, tracking through the expensive foundation on her cheek. How do you trust anyone after that? How do you let anyone close when the person who knows you best uses your mortality as leverage? Arthur reached into the tool bag, pulling out a small, fresh rubber O-ring. He held it up under the harsh kitchen light. You don't trust the same way. You don't ignore the warning lights on the dashboard anymore." He looked directly into her glass-green eyes, his gaze piercing the corporate armor, reaching the terrified human underneath. "I can fix a broken engine, Victoria. I can replace the belts, swap the pistons, and get it running again in a day. But trust isn't mechanics. Trust has to be rebuilt from scratch, one bolt at a time, and you only give the wrench to someone who is willing to get their hands dirty with you." He slid back under the sink. He threaded the new gasket onto the fitting. He tightened the brass nut, applying the exact amount of pressure required to seal the joint without stripping the threads. He turned the water valve back on. The dripping stopped completely. Perfect, silent functionality restored by competent hands. Victoria watched him slide out, pack his tools, and stand up. The physical presence of the man was a fortress. She had hired him to be a shield, a visual prop to scare a predatory board. But sitting in the cheap vinyl chair, listening to the silence of the repaired sink and the steady chirp of the heart monitor, she realized the terrifying truth. The contract was irrelevant. She was leaning on his stability not because he was paid to offer it, but because he was the only solid ground she had stood on in years. The vulnerability was terrifying, but for the first time since her diagnosis, the vulnerability felt like strength. Tuesday morning brought a sky the color of bruised iron and a biting wind that cut through heavy canvas work coats like razors. The Caldwell Logistics Regional Maintenance Hub was a symphony of industrial violence. Pneumatic drills screamed against steel, diesel engines roared, and the heavy metallic clanging of shipping containers echoed across the frozen mud of the yard. Arthur lay on a plastic creeper beneath the massive chassis of a Freightliner semi-truck. He wore heavy safety goggles, shielding his eyes from the rust flakes falling from the undercarriage. He gripped a heavy torque wrench, battling a seized suspension bolt. The cold seeped through the thin plastic of the creeper, sinking deep into the marrow of his spine. This was his domain, the mechanics of survival. A heavy pair of steel-toed boots stopped inches from his head. Arthur lowered the wrench. He kicked the asphalt, rolling the creeper out from beneath the massive axle. He sat up, pushing the goggles up onto his forehead. Gregson, the yard supervisor, stood looking down at him. Gregson was a 30-year veteran of the logistics game, a man who usually communicated in grunts and nods of mutual respect. Today, Gregson's face was pale, his jaw tight, his eyes avoiding Arthur's direct gaze. He held a yellow carbon copy clipboard crushed against his chest. "My office, Arthur!" Gregson's voice was a harsh bark, loud enough to cut through the ambient noise of the yard. "Now!" Arthur didn't ask questions. He stood, his massive frame towering over the supervisor. He wiped his greased hands on a shop rag. Dropping it onto a nearby toolbox, the other mechanics in the bay stopped working, the sudden cessation of their air tools creating an ominous silence. When the yard manager called the master mechanic into the glass box, it meant a corporate execution was underway. Arthur followed Gregson across the muddy asphalt, climbing the metal stairs to the prefabricated office trailer that overlooked the yard. Inside, the heater blasted dry, stale air. The walls were plastered with OSHA safety posters and faded calendars. Gregson slammed the door shut, cutting off the noise of the yard. He threw the clipboard onto his cluttered desk, dragging a trembling hand over his thinning hair. He finally looked Arthur in the eye, guilt and panic warring on his weathered face. Corporate safety auditors hit the system at 6 a.m. Gregson spat the words out like poison. They froze the local maintenance terminal. They pulled the service logs for the last 3 years. Every brake calibration, every hydraulic flush, every single sign-off you ever put your digital signature on. Arthur's face remained a mask of carved stone. His posture did not shift. He knew exactly what his logs contained. Perfect, uncompromising adherence to safety protocols. He never cut corners. He never approved a rig for the road if the telemetry was even slightly degraded. My logs are clean, Gregson. You know my work. It doesn't matter how clean the logs are, Gregson shouted, slamming his fist onto the desk. They aren't looking for reality, Arthur. They are looking for discrepancies. A missed timestamp, a delayed inventory scan on a replacement filter. The directive came from the top floor of the downtown tower. Someone with vice presidential clearance flagged your employee ID for a comprehensive liability review. The name hung in the stale air of the trailer, unspoken but deafening. Mitchell Davis, the invisible hand of corporate malice reaching down from the penthouse suite to crush a working man in the mud. The gala had been the catalyst. Mitchell had felt the humiliation of Arthur's physical dominance, and now he was utilizing the suffocating weight of the system to exact his revenge. Gregson sank into his desk chair, the fight draining out of him, leaving only the reality of middle management cowardice. They suspended your security clearance, Arthur. Pending the outcome of the audit, you can't touch a wrench. You can't be on the yard floor. The email implies gross negligence. If they make this stick, they won't just fire you. They will revoke your master certification. You'll never touch a commercial engine in this state again. The threat was absolute. Without his certification, Arthur was unemployable. Without employment, the health insurance holding the fragile line against Ruby's escalating daily medical costs would vanish instantly. Mitchell wasn't just trying to humiliate him. He was trying to starve him into submission. Arthur looked at the yellow clipboard on the desk. He looked at the supervisor, a man he had pulled double shifts for, a man he had respected. He saw the terror in Gregson's eyes, the fear of the corporate guillotine. You signed the suspension order. Arthur's statement was flat, devoid of anger, which made it infinitely more terrifying. Gregson swallowed hard, unable to meet the obsidian gaze boring into his soul. I have a mortgage, Arthur. I have kids in college. The email came from Mitchell Davis's chief of staff. I can't fight the top floor. I'm sorry. You need to clear out your locker. Arthur did not beg. He did not raise his voice. He did not explain the critical nature of his daughter's impending surgery. To plead with a coward was to surrender the only currency he truly owned. He stood perfectly straight, the stained canvas jacket stretching across his broad shoulders. He looked down at the man behind the desk. A man who buys loyalty never truly owns it, Gregson. He just rents it until a better offer comes along. You let them tell you what the truth is. Arthur turned and walked out of the glass-walled office. He descended the metal stairs into the freezing yard. The mechanics watched him in silence as he walked to his bay, collected his personal titanium wrenches, and placed them into his battered canvas bag. He zipped the bag shut, hoisted it over his shoulder, and walked to his truck. The war had escalated from a corporate skirmish into a direct assault on his survival. He gripped the steering wheel of the F-25. Oh, his knuckles white. Mitchell Davis had drawn first blood. Wednesday afternoon delivered a blow far more devastating than the loss of a job. Arthur sat at the small kitchen table staring blankly at a stack of classified ads. The phone on the counter buzzed, vibrating against the linoleum. The caller ID displayed Memorial Hospital, Pediatric Cardiology. He snatched the phone, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. "Jenkins!" "Arthur." Dr. Harris's voice was strained, the usual professional detachment stripped away, replaced by an uncomfortable, tight cadence. "Are you sitting down?" The temperature in the kitchen plummeted. Arthur stood up, his massive frame rigid. "What happened to Ruby's numbers?" "Ruby's telemetry is stable. Her numbers haven't changed since the weekend." The doctor paused, the silence stretching into an agonizing void. "It's the surgical schedule, Arthur. The hospital administration conducted a review of the upcoming mechanical valve procedures. There was a reallocation of specialized surgical resources. Ruby's slot for the second week of next month has been postponed." Arthur's grip on the plastic phone casing tightened until the material groaned. "Postponed until when?" 16 weeks. Dr. Harris whispered the words, knowing they were a death sentence. They bumped her down the priority list. They cited a shortage of the specific hardware and an administrative error in the initial booking. "You told me she had 8 weeks. Arthur's voice was a low, terrifying growl. The civilized veneer of the world was fracturing. "You looked me in the eye and said the mitral valve would fail in 10 weeks at the absolute maximum. 16 weeks kills my daughter." "I know." The doctor sounded genuinely broken. "Arthur, I fought them. I took the charts to the chief of surgery. I went to the medical ethics board, but the directive came down from the hospital's board of trustees. Someone triggered an external audit of the pediatric hardware allocation. The donor who funds the cardiovascular wing threatened to pull a multi-million-dollar grant if the administration didn't prioritize their specific list of charitable cases. They bumped 3 working-class patients to prioritize a PR initiative. Ruby was one of them." The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with sickening clarity. Memorial Hospital. The VIP wing. Mitchell Davis locking Victoria in the room to bleed. Mitchell Davis, a man who moved millions of dollars through charitable foundations to purchase leverage and power. The reach of the corporate vice president extended far beyond the logistics yard. He was utilizing the philanthropic arm of his empire to murder a 7-year-old girl simply to break the man standing in his way. Mitchell Davis. Arthur breathed the name, the syllables tasting like ash in his mouth. "Doctor." Harris gasped softly over the line. "I cannot confirm the names of the donors, Arthur. It would cost me my medical license. But you need to find an alternative facility immediately. I will transfer her files anywhere you want. There is no other facility that handles this specific hardware in the state," Arthur stated, his voice devoid of emotion, operating now entirely on the cold, brutal logic of a soldier trapped behind enemy lines. "Keep her on the list. I will fix the administrative error." He hung up the phone. The silence in the apartment was deafening, amplified by the absence of the chirping monitor. Ruby was at school, safe for the moment, unaware that the invisible gears of corporate malice were actively crushing her timeline. Arthur walked to the bookshelf in the living room. He looked at the photograph of Clara. He remembered holding her hand in the oncology ward, listening to the doctors explain that the experimental trial was simply too expensive for their coverage tier. He remembered the feeling of utter, suffocating powerlessness as the system calculated the value of his wife's life and found it insufficient. He placed his large hand flat against the glass of the picture frame. The dark, terrifying rage inside him compressed, transforming from a wildfire into a cold, concentrated laser. He would not bury his daughter. He would dismantle the entire corporate architecture of the city brick by brick before he let another woman he loved die, because a wealthy man manipulated the ledger. Thursday afternoon. The sky over Chicago threatened snow, heavy gray clouds pressing down on the city skyline. Arthur parked his truck 2 blocks away from the elementary school, walking the remaining distance. The neighborhood was rough, the chain-link fence surrounding the asphalt playground patched in several places. The shrill screams and laughter of children at recess echoed in the freezing air. Arthur approached the main gate. He stopped abruptly. A sleek midnight black town car idled at the curb directly in front of the school entrance. The engine hummed with expensive, silent precision. Mitchell Davis stood on the sidewalk, leaning casually against the polished fender of the vehicle. He wore a tailored cashmere overcoat and leather gloves, looking entirely out of place amidst the crumbling brick facades of the neighborhood. He was watching the children run across the asphalt, his silver hair unruffled by the biting wind. Arthur closed the distance with terrifying speed, his heavy boots silent on the concrete. He stepped directly into Mitchell's line of sight, placing his massive frame between the corporate vice president and the chain-link fence. Mitchell smiled, a cold, reptilian curving of his lips. He didn't flinch. He felt entirely protected by the invisible shield of his wealth. "Mr. Jenkins," Mitchell's voice was smooth, cultured, and dripping with venom. "I was just admiring the local infrastructure. It's fascinating how the lower income brackets manage their educational facilities. The resilience is quite touching." Arthur stood perfectly still. His hands hung loosely at his sides, fingers uncurled. The physical urge to reach out and crush the man's trachea was overwhelming, a primal instinct screaming for release. But violence was exactly what Mitchell wanted. Violence would result in handcuffs, police reports, and the immediate severing of the contract with Victoria. Violence would leave Ruby alone. "You are a long way from the penthouse, Mitchell." Arthur's baritone was a low, grinding gear. "If you are looking for a logistics hub to audit, you took a wrong turn." Mitchell chuckled, adjusting his leather gloves. "I heard about the unfortunate suspension at the yard. A tragic oversight in safety protocols. The corporate machinery can be so unforgiving when it comes to compliance. It's a shame. I understand you have pressing financial obligations." Mitchell turned his head slightly, his gaze attempting to pierce the chain-link fence to scan the playground. "A little girl, isn't it? 7 years old. Congenital heart defect. The healthcare system in this country is a tragedy, Arthur. The waiting lists, the bureaucratic delays. Sometimes a file just slips down the priority queue, and before you know it, time simply runs out. It requires influential friends to ensure the paperwork stays at the top of the pile." The psychological warfare was absolute. Mitchell was openly admitting to the attempted murder of a child, framing it as an administrative inevitability that only he could correct. Arthur stepped half the pace forward, violating Mitchell's personal space. The sheer physical density of the mechanic forced Mitchell to lean back against the town car. Arthur looked down into the older man's eyes, stripping away the cashmere and the silver hair, seeing the hollow, rotting core beneath. "You lock doors and let women bleed," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, absolute whisper that cut through the noise of the playground. "You use a sick child to manipulate a maintenance schedule. You think you are playing chess, Mitchell, but you are just a coward hiding behind a checkbook. If you look at my daughter again, if you breathe the air near this school again, the corporate HR department will be the least of your concerns." Mitchell's arrogant smile faltered for a fraction of a second. The raw, unfiltered menace radiating from Arthur was something his wealth could not insulate him against. He recovered quickly, pulling a thick, embossed business card from the inner pocket of his overcoat. He held it out, wedging it under the windshield wiper of his own car when Arthur refused to take it. "The board meeting is on Tuesday." Mitchell's voice lost its playful cadence, turning sharp and demanding. "Tomorrow night, 8 p.m., the private dining room at the Wellington Steakhouse downtown. Do not be late, Arthur. The surgical schedule at Memorial Hospital finalizes its Monday OR roster tomorrow at midnight. It would be a profound tragedy if a specific name didn't make the cut." Mitchell opened the rear door of the town car and slid into the luxurious leather interior. The tinted window rolled up, severing the connection. The vehicle pulled away from the curb, merging into the afternoon traffic, leaving Arthur standing on the freezing sidewalk. Arthur turned slowly, looking through the chain-link fence. He spotted the bright yellow sweater near the swings. Ruby was laughing, her small face flushed with the effort of pushing her friend. The monitor was hidden beneath her coat, but Arthur knew exactly how hard that failing valve was working to keep up with the joy of a recess break. The dark night of the soul descended not with a dramatic collapse, but with a slow, crushing suffocation. Arthur returned to the apartment. He sent Ruby to Mrs. Gable's for dinner, claiming he had an emergency repair job. He sat alone in the living room. The television was off, the lights were off. The only illumination came from the amber glow of the street lamp filtering through the window, casting long prison bar shadows across the floor. He stared at the photograph of Clara. The system was designed to break men like him. It was a machine built to grind down the working class, extracting their labor and discarding their humanity. Mitchell Davis controlled the levers of that machine. He controlled the logistics yard. He controlled the hospital board. He controlled the timeline of Ruby's life. The choice before Arthur was brutally binary. He could walk away from Victoria. He could let Mitchell seize control of Caldwell Logistics, dismantle the empire and destroy the woman who had finally found the courage to ask for a wrench to fix her broken trust. He could betray the only person in the corporate tower who had looked at him as a human being rather than a commodity. Or he could stand his ground, maintain his dignity, and watch his daughter die because a wealthy man decided to cross a name off a medical list. Arthur placed his head in his massive hands, his elbows resting on his knees. The silence of the apartment roared in his ears. He had promised Clara he would protect their little bird. He had promised Victoria he would not let the cowards step over her. The two vows were now locked in a fatal collision course, orchestrated by a man who understood the physics of desperation. He sat in the dark for 4 hours. He watched the shadows stretch and fade. He listened to the rattling of the radiator. He searched his soul for a compromise, a tactical maneuver that would allow him to save both the woman and the child. But the board was locked. Mitchell held all the pieces. Arthur stood up. His joints popped in the quiet room. He walked to the bookshelf and picked up the photograph of Clara. He traced the line of her smile with his grease-stained thumb. He knew what he had to do. The decision solidified in his chest, a cold, heavy block of absolute resolve. Courage had a cost. He was about to pay the invoice in full. Friday night. The Wellington Steakhouse was an enclave of old money, dark mahogany paneling, and the hushed, confidential murmurs of men who traded commodities and futures over $100 glasses of scotch. Arthur walked through the brass revolving doors. He did not wear the midnight blue suit Victoria had purchased. He wore his heavy canvas work jacket, dark denim jeans, and his scuffed steel-toed boots. He carried the scent of industrial cleaner and cold asphalt into the sanctuary of the elite. The maitre d' attempted to intercept him, his eyes scanning the dress code violation with practiced disdain. Arthur didn't break stride. He looked straight through the man, projecting a gravitational weight that forced the maitre d' to step aside in silent submission. Arthur navigated the labyrinth of linen-draped tables toward the back corridor. He opened the heavy oak door to the private dining room. Mitchell Davis sat alone at the head of a long, polished table. A crystal decanter of amber liquid sat before him, alongside a thick, leather-bound portfolio. The room smelled of aged beef, rich tobacco smoke, and the metallic tang of pure, unadulterated hubris. Mitchell smiled, gesturing to the empty chair opposite him. "Arthur, punctual. I appreciate a man who respects the schedule. Sit. I've ordered the Wagyu." Arthur did not sit. He closed the heavy oak door behind him, the latch engaging with a definitive click. He walked to the center of the room, standing beneath the low-hanging chandelier. He looked down at Mitchell. "The surgical roster finalizes at midnight." Arthur's voice was a low, steady thrum, devoid of any desperation. "Make your play, Mitchell." Mitchell sighed, an exaggerated expression of corporate fatigue. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and withdrew a crisp rectangular slip of paper. He placed it face up on the polished mahogany and slid it across the vast expanse of the table. It came to rest inches from Arthur's waist, a cashier's check, drawn on an offshore holding account, $3 million. $3 million. Mitchell steepled his fingers, leaning back in his leather chair. Tax-free, untraceable, and a guaranteed Priority 1 surgical slot for Ruby Jenkins at Memorial Hospital tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. The chief of cardiovascular surgery will handle the procedure personally. I have the authorization form already signed. Arthur looked down at the slip of paper. It was salvation. It was the future. It was college tuition, a safe neighborhood, and a mechanical heart valve that would beat for 80 years. It was everything he had bled for, and the cost. Arthur didn't ask it as a question. He stated it as a fact. Mitchell opened the leather portfolio. He pulled out a single sheet of legal paper covered in dense, bureaucratic text. He slid it across the table to rest beside the check. An affidavit. Mitchell's voice was smooth, persuasive, the sound of the devil negotiating a contract. Sworn testimony signed by you. To be presented at the board meeting on Tuesday. You will state, under oath, that Victoria Caldwell hired you as a paid actor. You will detail her erratic behavior, her paranoia, and her declining cognitive state due to the chemotherapy. You will confirm that she is entirely isolated, delusional, and unfit to command the logistics network. You take the money, your daughter gets her heart, and Victoria takes a quiet medical retirement. Everyone wins. Arthur stared at the affidavit. He read the words carefully crafted to destroy the Ice Queen, to shatter the armor she had allowed him to see behind. The document was a precise, calculated assassination of a woman's legacy and her sanity. He looked at the check. $3 million. He closed his eyes. The suffocating weight of the system pressed down on his shoulders. He saw Ruby's face. He saw Clara's garden blooming in the poisoned soil. He saw Victoria's trembling hands as she admitted her terror of betrayal. Arthur opened his eyes. The dark obsidian of his gaze locked onto Mitchell's arrogant, expectant face. Arthur reached out his massive, calloused hand. He placed his fingers on the crisp edge of the cashier's check. Mitchell smiled, a triumphant, sickening curvature of the lips. The working class always folded when the numbers got high enough. Arthur's fingers tightened. He did not pick the check up. He placed his thumb over the signature line and pushed the paper slowly, deliberately back across the polished mahogany table. He pushed it until it bumped against Mitchell's crystal decanter. Mitchell's smile vanished. His eyes widened in genuine, uncomprehending shock. Are you insane? That is your daughter's life on the table. Arthur stood perfectly straight. The canvas work jacket seemed to expand, filling the opulent room with the undeniable, terrifying presence of an honorable everyman who had finally drawn his line in the sand. I have dignity. Arthur's baritone resonated off the wood-paneled walls, an absolute, unyielding decree. I deserve respect, and right now, you are looking at a man who will not sell his soul to a coward who locks doors on bleeding women. You think you can buy my integrity to cover up your theft? You will lose everything, Mitchell shouted, his sophisticated veneer cracking completely, exposing the panicked rat beneath. They will cancel the surgery. I will end you. Arthur leaned forward, placing his massive hands flat on the mahogany table, invading Mitchell's space with the force of a falling anvil. The truth doesn't have a price tag, Mitchell. Arthur's voice was a low, terrifying promise. And I don't need your money to save my daughter. You just made the biggest mistake of your corporate life. You assumed I was fighting you with a wrench. You didn't realize I already have the blueprints to the entire machine. Arthur stood up. He did not look at the check again. He turned his back on the vice president of Caldwell Logistics and walked out of the private dining room, stepping back into the freezing Chicago night. The dark night of the soul was over. The war was no longer defensive. Arthur Jenkins was going on the offensive, and he was bringing the entire corrupt system crashing down. The freezing weekend crawled past with agonizing, measured slowness. Arthur did not sleep. The small apartment transformed into a war room illuminated by the harsh, singular beam of a desk lamp. He spread the logistics manifests across the worn linoleum of the kitchen floor. He cross-referenced paper trails with digital printouts smuggled from the yard. Before his access was terminated, Mitchell Davis possessed the arrogance of a man who believed the lower rungs of his empire were illiterate. It was a fatal miscalculation. Arthur traced the ghost invoicing scheme with the same surgical precision he used to diagnose a blown head gasket. Hundreds of purchase orders for heavy-duty pneumatic brakes, certified as installed on the Midwest fleet, yet the serial numbers corresponded to parts that never left the manufacturer. Millions of dollars bled into offshore accounts, categorized as routine maintenance. The vice president was stripping the armor off massive freight vehicles, risking the lives of drivers and the public to pad an invisible ledger. A sudden, sharp coughing fit from the bedroom shattered his intense focus. Arthur abandoned the papers, his large frame moving with silent speed down the narrow hallway. Ruby was sitting upright, her small chest heaving, the monitor emitting a rapid, distressed warning. The mitral valve was struggling under the pressure of the ambient cold. He lifted her fragile body, wrapping her in the thick purple quilt, carrying her into the steamy bathroom. He turned the shower on scalding hot, letting the thick mist fill the cramped space to ease her airways. He held her against his chest, feeling the terrifying, erratic flutter beneath her ribs. The $3 million check flashed in his memory, a phantom lifeline he had burned to the ground. He had chosen dignity. He had chosen the difficult, honorable path. But the immediate, visceral consequence of that choice was the agonizing struggle of the child in his arms. He buried his face in her dark curls, breathing in the scent of baby shampoo and fever. Monday arrived, draped in a suffocating gray overcast. Arthur spent the morning at the public library, utilizing the archaic, slow internet terminals to trace Mitchell's shell corporations. He connected the phantom parts suppliers to holding companies registered in the Cayman Islands. He compiled a master ledger binding the damning evidence into a single, unassailable dossier. He did not call Victoria. The contract demanded a united front, but this battle required a different geometry. If he warned her, the corporate surveillance monitoring her communications would alert Mitchell. The Ice Queen had to walk into the ambush completely blind, or the trap would fail. It was a brutal calculation, leaving her isolated during the final countdown, but a mechanic knows that a sealed pressure valve must be allowed to reach critical mass before the release mechanism can function effectively. Tuesday morning, the day of the board meeting. The Chicago skyline was obscured by a heavy driving sleet that coated the streets in black ice. Arthur, dressed in his heavy canvas work jacket, dark denim jeans, and scuffed steel-toed boots. He did not attempt to assimilate into the corporate aesthetic. The midnight blue suit remained hanging in the closet, a relic of a false performance. Today, he was not a hired companion. He was the master mechanic of the Caldwell logistics fleet, stepping into the arena wielding the brutal, unvarnished truth. He kissed Ruby's forehead as Mrs. Gable arrived to watch her. The older woman took one look at Arthur's obsidian, uncompromising gaze and simply nodded, locking the deadbolt behind him. The Caldwell Logistics corporate headquarters was an architectural monument to intimidation. 70 stories of mirrored glass and steel thrusting upward like a spear into the frozen clouds. Arthur parked his battered Ford F-250 in the subterranean executive garage, ignoring the blaring protests of the automated security kiosk. He walked toward the private elevator banks. 2 security guards in tailored uniforms stepped into his path, their hands resting cautiously near their utility belts. They evaluated his grease-stained jacket and imposing physical density, their professional arrogance faltering slightly under his intense, unblinking stare. "This area is restricted to executive personnel and verified board members," The lead guard's voice carried a tremor of genuine hesitation. "You need to exit the premises immediately." Arthur did not slow his momentum. He stepped directly into the guard's personal space, the sheer gravitational weight of his conviction forcing the man to instinctively retreat a half step. "I am Arthur Jenkins, Master Mechanic, Regional Hub 7. I am carrying the primary maintenance manifests required for the Emergency Medical Review Board meeting on the 68th floor. If you impede my progress, you will be named as an accessory to the active defrauding of this corporation." The guards exchanged a panicked, uncertain glance. The terminology was precise, the delivery absolute. In the hesitation, Arthur bypassed them, stepping into the sleek stainless steel elevator and pressing the executive override sequence he had memorized from a stolen logistics manual. The doors glided shut, sealing him inside the ascending metal tomb. The physical pressure in his ears mounted as the car rocketed skyward, carrying him toward the absolute apex of the empire. The 68th floor was a silent, sprawling expanse of polished marble, frosted glass, and rare mahogany. The air was climate-controlled to a perfect sterile temperature, carrying the faint scent of expensive espresso and ozone. Arthur moved down the corridor, his heavy boots leaving faint, damp tracks on the pristine floor. The double doors of the primary boardroom loomed at the end of the hall, flanked by enormous, abstract corporate art that meant absolutely nothing. He could hear the muffled, authoritative cadence of Mitchell Davis's voice vibrating through the heavy oak panels. The execution was already underway. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. 24 members of the Caldwell Board of Directors sat around a massive oval table carved from a single slab of imported walnut. The lighting was severe, focused entirely on the center of the room. Victoria Caldwell sat completely isolated at the far end of the table. She wore a stark, tailored white suit, the color washing out her pale skin, highlighting the devastating physical toll of her ongoing chemotherapy. Her green eyes were fixed straight ahead, an impenetrable fortress of absolute stoicism, refusing to give her executioners the satisfaction of seeing her bleed. Mitchell Davis paced near the panoramic windows, holding a laser pointer and a stack of medical evaluations. He projected a massive, digitally enhanced timeline onto the smart screen behind him. The presentation was a masterpiece of manipulative corporate warfare. He highlighted missed operational targets, correlating them directly with dates of Victoria's most aggressive medical treatments. He spun a narrative of a failing, delusional monarch desperately clinging to a crown she no longer possessed the cognitive capacity to wear. "We are facing an unprecedented crisis of leadership." Mitchell's voice dripped with manufactured sorrow. "Our founder built this company on stability and unyielding foresight. I have stood by Victoria through the darkest hours of her diagnosis, attempting to shield the operational infrastructure from her escalating physical and mental decline. But the logistics network is fracturing. We cannot allow sentimentality to blind us to the fiduciary reality. The CEO is isolated. The CEO is compromised. For the survival of the thousands of employees relying on this board, we must enact the incapacity clause immediately." A low murmur of agreement rippled through the older board members. The trap was perfectly constructed. Victoria sat motionless. She had no defense against her own bone marrow. She had expected Arthur to be sitting beside her, fulfilling the visual requirement of the contract, providing the silent, massive shield against this exact narrative. But the chair next to her was empty. The sudden, agonizing realization that the mechanic had finally been broken by the system, that Mitchell had successfully severed her only lifeline, threatened to shatter her carefully maintained ice armor. The isolation was absolute. Mitchell returned to his seat, steepling his fingers. He looked directly at Victoria, his eyes glowing with predatory triumph. "I call for an immediate binding vote to transfer executive authority to the Vice President's office, effective immediately." The heavy oak doors of the boardroom violently blew open. The massive slabs of wood slammed against the marble walls with a sound like a detonating artillery shell. The entire board physically jumped, their heads snapping toward the entrance. Arthur Jenkins stepped over the threshold. The brutal, unvarnished reality of the working class had breached the absolute sanctity of the penthouse. He did not pause. He did not wait for an invitation. He marched down the length of the walnut table, the heavy thud of his steel-toed boots echoing like a war drum. Victoria's breath caught in her throat. The green of her eyes flared with a sudden, brilliant intensity. He had not abandoned the line. He had simply changed the rules of engagement. Mitchell leapt to his feet, his tailored suit jacket pulling tight across his chest, his face contorted in genuine, unfiltered rage. "Security! How did this man get up here? This is a closed executive session!" Arthur ignored the shouting vice president entirely. He reached the center of the table and slammed his thick, heavily bound dossier onto the polished walnut. The impact rattled the crystal water glasses of the surrounding executives. He planted his massive hands flat on the table, leaning forward, capturing the absolute attention of every billionaire in the room through sheer, undeniable physical density. "My name is Arthur Jenkins." His baritone rumbled through the chest cavities of the men sitting closest to him. "I am the master mechanic for Regional Hub 7. Mitchell Davis just told you that the logistics network is fracturing because of the CEO's medical leave. He is lying. The logistics network is fracturing because the vice president has been actively stripping the armor off your fleet to line his own offshore pockets." The boardroom erupted into chaotic shouting. Several executives demanded his immediate removal. Mitchell scrambled for the intercom, his fingers trembling with sudden, catastrophic panic. "Sit down and look at the ledger." Arthur's command sliced through the noise, a booming, authoritative roar that silenced the room instantly. "I have dignity. I deserve respect, and you are going to respect the men who die on the highways when those brakes fail." Arthur flipped the heavy dossier open, spinning it to face the center of the board. He did not rely on corporate jargon. He relied on the absolute, uncompromising mathematics of heavy machinery. Page 4. Purchase orders for high-pressure pneumatic braking systems. Authorized by Mitchell Davis's digital signature. 300 units allegedly installed in the Midwest fleet over the last 4 months. I manage that fleet. Not a single new pneumatic system has crossed my bay. You are currently running 2-ton rigs on degraded, uncalibrated calipers, while $24 million was routed to a shell supplier registered in the Cayman Islands. The color drained entirely from Mitchell's face. He backed away from the table, his mouth opening and closing without producing a sound. Arthur flipped the page, his grease-stained thumb leaving a dark smudge on the pristine white paper. Page 12. Hydraulic fluid recycling protocols. The VP claimed an operational efficiency upgrade, cutting the maintenance budget by 12%. He didn't upgrade the system. He ordered the regional hubs to bypass the filtration cycle. You have heavy-duty engines grinding themselves into shrapnel across 3 states. The invoices match the phantom parts. The signature matches the vice president. An older board member, a man who had built the original fleet alongside Victoria's grandfather, pulled the dossier toward him. He adjusted his reading glasses, his eyes scanning the irrefutable, mathematically perfect documentation. He looked up, his gaze locking onto Mitchell. The betrayal in the older man's eyes was absolute. "Is this accurate, Mitchell?" The board member's voice was a terrifying, quiet whisper. "Did you authorize the diversion of safety funds to this offshore entity?" "It's a fabrication!" Mitchell shrieked, his sophisticated veneer dissolving into the pathetic flailing of a trapped, cornered animal. "He is a disgruntled, suspended employee. Victoria hired him to disrupt the board. He is a paid actor. Look at the medical chart. Look at the timeline." Arthur stood perfectly straight, smoothing the front of his canvas jacket. He looked directly at the panicked vice president. You offered me $3 million on Friday night at the Wellington Steakhouse to sign a false affidavit against Ms. Caldwell. You offered to bump my dying daughter to the top of the surgical priority list if I committed perjury. I pushed the check back, because the truth doesn't have a price tag. The silence in the boardroom was absolute, crushing, apocalyptic. The revelation of the bribe combined with the catastrophic mechanical fraud sealed the tomb. The corporate machinery previously weaponized against Victoria instantly realigned its crosshairs. The board members scrambled away from Mitchell, creating a physical void around the disgraced executive. Victoria stood up slowly. The stark white suit no longer looked like a shroud. It looked like the armor of a conquering monarch. She did not look at Mitchell. She looked at the senior board member. The incapacity clause requires a unanimous vote, Victoria stated, her voice crystalline, carrying the terrifying authority of a woman who had just survived the firing squad. I believe the motion has failed. Furthermore, as Chief Executive Officer, I am initiating an immediate, comprehensive external audit of the Vice President's financial authorizations. Security will escort Mr. Davis to the lobby. The FBI's white-collar division has already been provided a duplicate of Mr. Jenkins's dossier. Mitchell collapsed into his leather chair, burying his face in his trembling hands. The empire he had attempted to steal had shattered beneath him, dismantled by a man wielding nothing more than a wrench and uncompromising integrity. Victoria turned her gaze down the length of the massive walnut table. She looked at Arthur. The physical distance between them was significant, but the energetic connection hummed like a live, high-voltage wire. He had not just protected her, he had vindicated her entirely. He had proven that character was a greater currency than wealth. The immediate aftermath was a blur of corporate panic and structural realignment. Security removed Mitchell Davis from the premises. Board members tripped over themselves to pledge allegiance to the surviving CEO. Through the chaos, Arthur silently retreated. He stepped back through the heavy oak doors, walking toward the elevator banks. His job was done. The Ice Queen's throne was secure. The mechanical integrity of the fleet would be restored. Arthur, the voice echoed down the polished marble corridor. Victoria stood in the doorway of the boardroom, having abandoned her sycophantic executives. She walked toward him, her heels clicking rapidly against the stone floor. She closed the distance, stopping mere inches from his chest. The adrenaline of the battle was crashing, leaving her raw, exposed, and trembling slightly. She reached into the pocket of her tailored suit. She pulled out a pristine, embossed check, the remaining $750,000 of the contract, the final payment for services rendered. Her hand shook as she held it out to him. Her green eyes were wide, frantic, fighting the overwhelming surge of terrifying vulnerability. The threat was gone, the war was won, but the prospect of the silence that would follow his departure was suddenly infinitely more terrifying than the cancer in her blood. She was attempting to rely on the only language she had ever known, transactional distance. She was trying to buy the safety of an endpoint before he could simply walk away. Arthur looked at the slip of paper. He did not raise his hand. He looked down at her face, seeing the frantic, desperate attempt to rebuild the ice armor before it melted entirely. "Take it." Victoria's voice cracked, a fragile, broken sound. "The contract is fulfilled. You went above and beyond the parameters. The board is secure. You need this for Ruby's recovery. Take the escrow." Arthur's jaw tightened. The dark obsidian depth of his gaze anchored her, refusing to let her escape into the comfortable safety of corporate procedure. He reached out, his massive, calloused fingers wrapping around her wrist, gently but firmly pushing the check back toward her chest. "I can rebuild a company, Victoria." His baritone was a low, devastatingly gentle rumble that vibrated through the silent corridor. "I can tear down a fraudulent ledger and rebuild an engine block from the ground up. But I cannot rebuild a fake family. I am not a line item on your balance sheet." Victoria gasped. A small, choked sound. The tears she had ruthlessly suppressed during the boardroom execution finally breached the dam. They spilled hot and fast down her pale cheeks. I don't know how to do this. Oh, I don't know how to exist without the armor. Everyone I have ever trusted has evaluated my worth based on a ledger. I am terrified that if you stay, you will eventually calculate the math and realize I am broken machinery. Arthur stepped closer, eliminating the remaining physical distance between them. The heavy canvas of his jacket brushed against the pristine white silk of her suit. He lifted his hand, his grease-stained thumb gently wiping a tear from her cheek. The gesture was profoundly intimate, stripping away the CEO and the master mechanic, leaving only two battered human beings standing in the ruins of a corporate war zone. You are allowed to be happy. Arthur's words were a command, an absolute granting of permission that she had never received in her entire life. You survived the bad guys, you fought the poison in the ground. You deserve the garden that grows afterward. Victoria looked up into his unyielding eyes. The absolute moral clarity of the man shattered the final microscopic layer of her defense. The truth ripped its way out of her chest, raw and undeniable. I don't want this to be an act anymore. She whispered the words, her voice trembling violently. I don't want a contract. I love you, Arthur, but I am terrified I will ruin it. Arthur did not smile, but the fierce, protective intensity in his face softened into something breathtakingly profound. He required her to claim the ground she was standing on. He required her to own the vulnerability entirely, because vulnerability was the only true measure of courage. Say it again. His voice was a low, demanding rumble. Look at me when you say it. Victoria drew a deep, shuddering breath. She stopped trembling. She squared her shoulders, looking directly into the dark, steady ocean of his eyes. She surrendered the armor completely. I love you. Her voice was clear, steady, echoing down the empty marble hall. I love you, and I want this to be real. Arthur exhaled, a long, deep release of breath. He wrapped his massive arms around her, pulling her against his chest. He buried his face in her dark hair, inhaling the scent of sandalwood and absolute victory. It's real, Victoria. We're going to build it from the ground up, and we aren't going to let anyone tear it down. The immediate days following the boardroom massacre were a whirlwind of systemic correction. With Mitchell Davis formally indicted and the philanthropic leverage severed, the hospital administration miraculously discovered the administrative error regarding the pediatric surgical roster. Ruby's priority status was instantly restored Wednesday morning, the sterile, brightly lit waiting room of Memorial Hospital's cardiovascular wing. Arthur sat rigidly in a plastic chair, his elbows resting on his knees, his massive hands clasped together in silent prayer. Victoria sat directly beside him. She did not wear a tailored suit. She wore comfortable jeans and a soft, oversized sweater. Her hand was intertwined with his, her thumb gently stroking the heavy calluses on his knuckles. She was not a corporate prop. She was the emotional anchor holding him to the earth while his daughter's chest was opened on an operating table 2 floors above. The agonizing hours dragged into the afternoon. The rhythmic ticking of the waiting room clock was a physical torture. Arthur stared at the floor, the phantom echo of Clara's final days threatening to pull him under. Victoria leaned closer, resting her head against his broad shoulder, offering the scent unyielding presence he had provided her during the chemotherapy sessions. The mutual reliance was absolute. They had forged a bond in the crucible of survival, and the alloy was unbreakable. The heavy double doors of the surgical suite finally swung open. Dr. Aris walked out, still wearing his blue scrubs, his surgical mask pulled down around his neck. The profound exhaustion on his face was eclipsed by a brilliant, radiant smile. Arthur stood up so fast his plastic chair clattered backward onto the linoleum. Victoria stood with him, her grip on his hand tightening like a vice. The valve is seated perfectly. Dr. Aris's voice was the most beautiful sound Arthur had ever heard. The regurgitation is completely eliminated. Her heart is pumping efficiently. The bypass transition was seamless. She is in recovery, Arthur. She is going to be perfectly fine. Arthur dropped his head backwards, staring blindly at the acoustic ceiling tiles. A massive, shuddering sob ripped through his chest, the violent release of months of suffocating terror. He turned, pulling Victoria into a crushing embrace, lifting her completely off the floor. She wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder, crying tears of pure, unadulterated joy. The timeline was defeated. The little bird was going to fly. 2 years later, the warm golden sunlight of a late May afternoon baked the fresh asphalt of the Caldwell-Jenkins Automotive Academy. The sprawling, state-of-the-art campus sat on the revitalized footprint of a formerly abandoned industrial park on the south side of Chicago. The facility was an architectural marvel of glass and exposed steel, featuring 12 fully equipped training bays, advanced diagnostic laboratories, and a sweeping outdoor test track. The air carried the familiar, comforting scent of fresh motor oil, hot rubber, and unbridled potential. Arthur stood at the head of Bay 4, wiping his hands on a pristine red shop rag. He wore a heavy canvas jacket, the fabric clean and unfrayed, bearing the embroidered logo of the academy over his heart. He watched a group of diverse, working-class teenagers huddled around a suspended Cummins diesel engine. They were arguing passionately about torque specifications, their faces smeared with grease and absolute determination. He had built the academy utilizing the corporate funding Victoria had insisted on allocating. It was a sanctuary for the kids the system tried to discard, teaching them the honorable mechanics of survival, giving them the tools to command their own respect. A sudden high-pitched squeal of pure joy echoed across the pristine yard. Arthur turned, a deep, genuine smile breaking across his face. Ruby, now 9 years old, was sprinting across the asphalt. She moved with terrifying speed, a blur of boundless, unconstrained energy. The pediatric monitor was gone. The sluggish, blue-tinged exhaustion was a forgotten nightmare. She was vibrant, healthy, and growing taller every day. She wore a denim jacket covered in aerospace patches, her dark curls flying wildly behind her. She launched herself at Arthur. He caught her effortlessly, swinging her high into the air, her laughter ringing like crystal bells against the backdrop of the revving engines. "Did you finish the lesson, Daddy?" Ruby demanded, breathless, resting her hands on his broad shoulders. "Just wrapping it up, little bird," Arthur rumbled, setting her gently back onto the ground. "Did you finish your robotics project?" "Mama helped me solder the final circuit board." Ruby pointed proudly toward the glass-walled administrative building overlooking the yard. Arthur looked up. Victoria was walking out of the double glass doors, stepping into the warm afternoon sun. The physical transformation was breathtaking. The gaunt, pale Ice Queen was entirely gone, replaced by a woman radiating profound, grounded health. Her dark hair was thick and glossy, her skin flushed with genuine color. She wore a simple sundress, the fabric shifting gently in the spring breeze. The cancer had been in complete remission for 18 months. She had stepped down as the sole CEO, restructuring the board, promoting ethical leadership, and reclaiming her own life from the crushing machinery of the empire. She walked toward them, her face illuminated by a smile so bright and unreserved it rivaled the sun itself. She was holding a small, sleeping infant strapped to her chest in a fabric carrier. The baby boy, only 3 months old, possessed Arthur's dark, peaceful features and Victoria's absolute serenity. Arthur walked forward to meet her halfway across the yard. The mechanics in the bays watched with quiet, reverent respect. They knew the legend of the man who had torn down a corrupt vice president to protect his family. They knew the truth of his character. Victoria stopped, resting her hand lightly over the sleeping infant's back. She looked up at Arthur, her green eyes shining with an emotion that no corporate ledger could ever quantify. It was the look of a woman who had been utterly dismantled by life, only to be meticulously, lovingly rebuilt by a master mechanic. "The board just approved the expansion grant for the second academy location," Victoria said. her voice rich with satisfaction. "We break ground in September." Arthur reached out, his large, calloused thumb gently stroking the soft cheek of his newborn son. He then cupped Victoria's face, leaning down to press a slow, deep kiss to her lips. It was a kiss grounded in absolute certainty, a daily affirmation of the truth they had fought a war to claim. "You built a good engine, Victoria," Arthur murmured, stepping back and looking at his daughter, his wife, and his son. The fractured pieces of their separate tragedies had been forged in the fire of uncompromising integrity, creating a structure that could withstand any storm. Ruby grabbed Victoria's free hand, tugging her toward the nearest service bay. "Come look, Mama. The students finally got the alternator mounted." Victoria laughed, a rich melodic sound that filled the yard, allowing herself to be pulled along by the sheer momentum of the child's enthusiasm. Arthur watched them walk away. He stood in the warm sun, feeling the solid asphalt beneath his steel-toed boots. He remembered the freezing Chicago night, the despair of the broken circuit board, the terrifying choice between a $3 million bribe and his own soul. He had refused to compromise his dignity. He had dragged the truth out into the harsh light, forcing the corrupt system to break against his unyielding character. The honorable everyman had not taken a shortcut. He had paid the cost of courage in full. And the universe, in all its chaotic, unpredictable mechanics, had rewarded him with the only currency that truly mattered: a life built on truth, a family secured by sacrifice, an earned, unshakable peace. He adjusted the collar of his canvas jacket, turned his back on the shadows of the past, and walked toward the light of the open bay doors to join his family.